Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth Moore, Chief of the Programs and Education Department at the new National Museum of the United States Army. We are located at Fort Belvoir. We are temporarily closed due to COVID restrictions, but when we open up, we hope to have you all as frequent visitors and hope you'll visit with us soon after we open. Um, my name is John Moss, and I have the privilege to be able to introduce and talk with Jeff tonight. Jeff Matthews is a professor at the University of Puget Sound, and let me go over to that. He is the George Frederick Jewett Distinguished Professor at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. He teaches American history and leadership and has written or edited 3 previous books, including Black Sheep Leadership and another one, The Art of Command, Military Leadership from George Washington to Colin Powell. So he is well qualified to write a volume about Colin Powell, a biography that I just had the privilege of being able to read. I highly recommend it. So welcome, a very good evening to Jeff Matthews, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Very good. Thank you, John. It's a really special honor to be hosted by the museum for a couple of reasons. One, my father was career Army, did 2 tours in Vietnam. And of course, it's a special honor to be hosted by the museum for a Black History Month and to speak about General Powell. Right, a true trailblazer and still a role model for the Army. And it's pretty fitting too that 20 years ago, when General Powell became the first Black Secretary of State, 20 years later, we have General Lloyd Austin becoming the first Black Secretary of Defense. And so it just really is a nice bookend, and I really appreciate being here.
Great, and very good evening to our audience tonight. Looks like we're gonna go over 200 at least, so it's a great crowd. You can ask questions in the chat function, and at the end of the program, we're going to save some time to ask and get through as many questions as we can from Jeff Matthews. So, Jeff, one of the things that strikes me at this point in time at my age is that some people have never heard of Colin Powell. So we are going to ask you to give us just a bare bones a biography overview of his positions chronologically, and then we'll get into each one in a serial way. So tell us a little bit about Colin Powell, his trajectory.
Sounds good. Yeah, so General Powell was born in 1937 in Harlem. He was raised in the South Bronx of New York, went to public school, ended up going to college at City College of New York. And that's where he discovered ROTC and joined ROTC. He went into active duty right after graduating and spent a 35-year career in the Army, which included 2 tours in Vietnam. At the age of 42, he was the youngest brigadier general in the Army. At the time he was 49, he had become the Deputy National Security Advisor during the Reagan administration and was the first African-American to hold that post. And shortly after that, he was elevated to become Ronald Reagan's final national security advisor at the age of 50. At 52, he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President George Bush the Elder, and again was not only the first African-American to become chairman, but he was also the first ROTC graduate to become chairman. During his time as chairman is where he's most well known, because he became the public face of 2 successful wars, first in Panama and then in the Persian Gulf. And as the time as chairman is really where he rose to be what's arguably the most respected, the most trusted American leader at the time, supported both by Republicans and by Democrats, but also independents. At this time, Senator John McCain at the time declared that Colin Powell was the greatest American general since World War II. Powell retires in 1994. He publishes his autobiography, My American Journey, shortly after that, becomes a runaway bestseller, goes on a 60 city book tour. I describe it as similar almost to Beatlemania as Powellmania. The country just adored General Powell. He considers running for president in 1996 against Bill Clinton, but he doesn't. And he retires into private life, civilian life, for 7 years, doing both charitable work and public speaking. And then in 2000, he campaigns for George W. Bush for president. And when Bush wins, he quickly selects Powell to become Secretary of State.
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear Jeff?
Yes, I can hear you, John.
Okay, we dropped you for a minute there. I believe the last thing I heard was Secretary of State, I believe, or maybe you haven't gotten to that. But if you could just pick up the pace there, pick up the trail there.
Yes. So where I just finished was after 7 years in retirement, civilian life, he campaigns for George W. Bush for president in 2000, and he gets selected as Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you there. We'll keep on going on this. Why don't we, Elizabeth, we have a few shots of Powell as a child. We're not going to dwell much on his childhood here. Jeff, why don't you tell us who these folks are and kind of what age Powell was and what these occasions were?
Yeah, so this is a Powell in his high school years with his parents and his older sister. And Powell's parents were immigrants from Jamaica, came to the United States in the 1920s. Working class people, both worked in the garment district. You could characterize Powell's upbringing as a very loving one in the home. He was a very good, obedient child. Personality-wise, very good-natured. He had many friends, and he described himself ultimately as a child as being amiable but aimless, so not really having strong direction. He was not a great athlete by any means. He was not a great student by any means. His sister would later say, there certainly were no signs of greatness in Powell's childhood. After he graduates from high school at the age of 16, he ends up entering City College of New York in 1954.
Okay, and let's move on one more slide. And we have the ROTC. That is his ROTC
Yeah.
uniform there at City College of New York. And so let's just talk about that for a second there. You mentioned that his commission was ROTC. For somebody to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and not having gone to West Point, that's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It was, and my own brother who graduated from ROTC, I just remember how proud people in ROTC and graduates of ROTC were to see Powell elevated regardless of what service you were in. It was really a meaningful change, I think, in the history of the position. Now, in terms of Powell not going to West Point, there are several reasons why I would say he didn't go. Certainly, when Powell graduated from high school, he didn't have a burning desire to even go to college, period. It was his parents, especially his mom, who really wanted him to go to college, and as a dutiful son that he did. And his family also didn't have a deep connection to the military. There wasn't the attraction of West Point there. But probably most importantly, Powell really didn't have the grades and qualifications for admissions into West Point. But once he gets to City College and he discovers ROTC, then the light comes on for him. And finally, his ambition, his intrinsic motivation, he's really found his home and his professional calling. So really his route to the military.
Jeff, one of the main themes of your biography is this notion of followership, and that Powell was in some ways the ultimate subordinate. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you chose to emphasize that so strongly in the book?
Yeah, my central research question going into the book was, how can we explain Powell's remarkable arc, right? So how does someone with his background, as we've discussed it already, with no signs of greatness, how does he then, in the end, become the most important, the most popular, the most trusted military political figure of his generation, right? So my question was, how do we explain the phenomenon, right, that is his career? And certainly the conventional wisdom has been, and in many ways still is, well, he was a great leader, and that explained his rapid rise through the ranks. And certainly, I argue in the book that he was a very effective leader as a battalion commander in Korea, for example, or as a brigade commander with the 101st Airborne in Kentucky, and that's true. But as I got into the research, what I realized was that what was a more important explanation for his rise to power and prominence was that he was an extraordinary subordinate. And he was a subordinate, a deputy, and aide to increasingly important military and civilian leaders who advanced his career and even bailed him out if he ever got into trouble. And so Powell, as a senior officer, spent a disproportionate amount of his career as a staff officer at the Pentagon or in DC, not as a traditional general out commanding troops out in the field. So in short, he was an exceptionally talented bureaucrat and deputy at the senior ranks.
Good, got it. So you mentioned that he, his career seemed to have some leapfrogging and some really interesting turning points where he had almost sponsors or patrons in the ranks above him. Was that also important in advancing his career?
It was absolutely important, and he would call this large collection of people. It wasn't just one or two or three people. He would call them his godfathers or his rabbis, people that would sponsor him, advise him, help his career in terms of positions that he would get. And he was continually advanced ahead of his peers. And if I were to summarize in a couple of ways why this was, certainly he had absolute superior dedication to the military arms profession. His competence and effectiveness was categorically obvious to all of his superiors. And certainly I would say that he had unquestioning loyalty to his superiors who trusted him absolutely. And so this idea that these very powerful civilian and military leaders or mentors, they are really important parts of his story, of his arc in terms of helping champion his career. And so for students, I often use Powell as a great example of the power of networks, the power of mentors, the power of models, and the powers of one's superiors, whether you necessarily like them or not, can have just disproportional influence on your career, both good and bad.
So in the 1950s and 60s, as he's going through high school and college and ROTC, those are turbulent times as far as race relations in America and civil rights. But it seems anyway, at least from your book and from other sources, interviews, that race doesn't really come up much when it comes to Powell's Army career, his advancement. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so here I relied a lot on Powell's retelling of his own experience from a race perspective. In his autobiography, he discusses about growing up in the South Bronx in a very ethnically and racially diverse neighborhood, and he did not face the kind of racism and the harsh discrimination that many, if not most, Black Americans at the time did in other parts of the country. And so he realizes he had an unusual experience in that sense. As far as in the military, he writes clearly that he saw racism in the military. He enters the military in 1958, so integration was still relatively new. But he did not personally frequently feel constrained by the Army, and he really saw the Army as a meritocracy. He said clearly racism existed, and he admits that he was the beneficiary over the years of affirmative action, either directly or indirectly. And it's interesting that he was very impressed with Black soldiers that he served with who grew up in the South, as an example, who had a completely different and oppressive experience growing up. And to see them excel in the military gave him that much more pride in the Army, in particular, that those soldiers could do well. So at the beginning, I would say Powell wanted to be seen as an excellent officer. He didn't want to be seen as an excellent Black officer. And I would say for the most part of his career, his superiors regarded him that way. They regarded him as simply an excellent officer who happened to be Black, and that was Powell's primary objective from a profession standpoint.
Great. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to move in to talk about his Vietnam War experience. And here you have, he was very well regarded as an officer by his superiors during the Vietnam War. Can you tell us a little bit about what his experiences were as far as in the field and what his main responsibilities were?
Yeah, absolutely. So Powell served 2 tours in Vietnam, and both were highly successful for him and both advanced his career. The first tour came early in 1962-63, where Powell served as a combat advisor to a South Vietnamese infantry regiment. During the time he spent there, he had 3 or 4 different Vietnamese commanders that he worked with. At one point, he gets injured stepping on a punji stick, of which they have to remove him from the field. He earns a Purple Heart for his service and rave reviews for what he did working with the South Vietnamese. He serves his second tour much later in 1968, right when the war is a much different state. This time he's serving as a staff officer, and here again he excels. And in this particular position that he has, he's frequently flying to combat zones with his superiors. And there's one episode that happens when the helicopter he's in, which includes a major general that he works for, actually crashes out in the jungle, and Powell fractures his ankle, but there are unconscious people in the helicopter still, and Powell heroically rescues the general and some of the other people, including one of the pilots. And for this, Powell earns the Soldier's Medal, one of the most prestigious medals the Army gives. And so in both circumstances, he excelled. And by the time he came back to the United States, close to 1970, he was considered what's called, often referred to as one of these walk-on-water types. Everything that he seems to be doing, he's doing exceptionally well and getting rave reviews by very high-ranking general officers. And so when he comes back to the United States, he's really well poised to take them the next step in his career. John, your microphone is muted.
Thank you. You mentioned in the book a phrase that Powell used that he came across during his Vietnam War time period called breaking starch, a phrase that was used. What does that mean, and what did it mean to Powell?
For Powell, it was a way of how can you be successful in the Army of that time, of the post-Korea era. And breaking starch was a pejorative that was used, that to be successful in the Army often rewarded officers more for appearances and more for their loyalty than actually for personal integrity and substance. So as long as your unit looked mission ready, that was more important than actually being mission ready in terms of getting positive reviews. And Powell admits that, he says in his autobiography, I broke starch with the best of them, that he knew he had to play kind of what the game was, what the culture of the Army was to be successful at the time. He wasn't proud of it in hindsight, and certainly post-Vietnam, as Powell plays a big role in helping the reformation of the Army to get the modern Army that ultimately will fight in the Persian Gulf War. All right, so this era of breaking starch is over. The term breaking starch comes from this idea of appearances being so important that GIs would so starch their fatigue pants, they would be like cardboard bricks. And the only way you could get your foot into one of these heavily starched and ironed things was to shove a broomstick into the pant leg in order to get your leg in there. And that's where you're breaking the starch.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we have one more slide of kind of this interim period here. It looks like he's meeting President Nixon there. What was this while he was in a graduate program, I believe you go into in the book?
Powell did go to graduate school. He got his MBA at George Washington when he came back from his second tour. This picture actually is more connected to after that, Powell got selected for a prestigious White House Fellows program, where he worked for a year within the administration. And for Powell, he considered this kind of a form of graduate school, of field work, to see how government really is executed by bureaucrats. And again, he starts working for civilians who end up not only respecting his abilities, but helping his career along. So that's the error from this photo.
So during that time, his observation of bureaucrats, what was his, what did he come away with from that period of time? What did he learn as kind of observing civilians in high position?
What he came away with was a real understanding of how legislation is made, how policy is made, and how dirty it could be. So this idea of how the sausage is made, and as Bismarck would say, and how power is used. And so one of his bosses was a gentleman by the name of Malik, and he said, "Boy, when people when he had to call for Malik to other agencies, when they heard Malik was on the line, it was like the Godfather was calling, and people started shaking on the other end." And so, unlike some military people in similar type positions working for civilians, in terms of understanding politics, Powell was not put off by the politics. He saw that it was dirty, but he was more intrigued about how things actually got accomplished. And this will help his career in many ways, because he ends up spending so much time in Washington and ultimately working at the White House as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff intimately. And so this is a really important part of his practical education. Even though he's not out commanding troops, it ends up becoming really important in his skill set as a senior officer when he becomes a flag officer later.
So let's go to the next slide. Jeff, one of the big surprises that I had reading this book, and I was recently out of college during the Iran-Contra hearings and when that scandal broke, and so I remember quite a bit of it from TV and newspapers. But I was very surprised about Powell's role in this, which I never seemed to know. It's probably my oversight, but can you tell us just a little bit about what the Iran-Contra scandal was about, and then Powell's role in it?
Yes, happy to. And John, I think the reason why this has been one of the more surprising, revealing parts of the book is because no one has really written about it that much. Even Karen DeYoung's really good book and a very detailed biography that she wrote 10 plus years ago, she doesn't discuss it that much either. And so this has been really fascinating for me too, because I didn't remember Powell's role myself. And so in short, in terms of the Iran-Contra scandal, which happens late in the Reagan administration in the second term, by then Powell was a two-star general, and he was working again at the Pentagon. He was the senior military assistant for the Secretary of Defense, who was Caspar Weinberger, a close confidant of President Reagan. Now, the Iran part of the Iran-Contra scandal had to do with the Reagan administration illegally selling missiles to Iran, which was a declared terrorist state. Reagan's hope was to have American hostages released in kind of an arms for hostages deal. And in general, you could say Defense Secretary Weinberger and General Powell generally opposed the selling of missiles to Iran. However, and they believed that it was illegal to do so. However, they were complicit in the activity nonetheless, which in the end, there were at least 7 shipments of arms and failed in the duty to notify Congress, which was by statute what they had to do when we're selling arms in this kind of situation. And after the scandal broke, both Weinberger and Powell also participated in a cover-up to protect themselves and to protect the president from the multiple investigations that ensued over the illegal activities, both in dealing with Iran and the Contras, which were insurgent fighters in Nicaragua trying to overthrow the government, which we were also supporting illegally. And this is where Oliver North becomes very famous in the televised hearings. And I've been asked often, John, why if Powell had a role in the scandal, why then didn't it come back to haunt him in some way? And this is an absolutely fascinating part of the story, because one of the reasons it didn't come back to haunt him is because after Powell had served Secretary Weinberger for 3 years, he was then given a corps to run in Germany. And so he was out of the White House when the scandal broke open publicly. And another reason he avoided kind of getting caught up in it, he was not asked to testify like Oliver North was, for example, or others in the televised hearings. And then finally, and most importantly, why he didn't get really caught up in it was because eventually Defense Secretary Weinberger gets indicted for 5 felonies, including obstruction of justice, and he was set to go on trial. And Powell certainly, as his top military assistant, was going to have to testify. And he was going to have to really face whether he's going to tell the truth or not. But at the last minute, President George H.W. Bush pardons Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, who was retired by then, and therefore there's no trial, and therefore Powell does not have to testify. And the last thing I'll say, John, that's just completely ironic is after the scandal breaks open, the Reagan administration brings Powell back early from Germany to help clean up the mess of the National Security Council, led by General Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North as his key action officer. And this is where Powell becomes deputy national security advisor to help get the National Security Council out of operations, out of covert operations, and more its coordinating policy within the administration. And then after a year or so, Powell gets elevated to become Reagan's 6th and final national security advisor. And in both of those positions, he gets very high marks for his professionalism and effectiveness in resetting the course of foreign policy for the last year of the Reagan administration.
So if I remember correctly, Powell and Weinberger, they could smell this kind of arms for hostages right from the beginning, and were very, very reluctant to get to approve it, to get involved with it. But somehow along the way, they went along with it. Is that your conclusion?
Yes, absolutely. The first time Powell sees a memorandum talking about the idea of doing this, he runs it to Caspar Weinberger, and they both think it's just a crazy idea and it should never be done. And Weinberger immediately says this would be illegal if we do it. The problem is the president really wants to do it. And the president decides that we are going to do it, and he continually gives his personal approval to the National Security Council at the time to have these shipments through Israel begin. And Weinberger and Powell, they oppose it continuously going on, but they never go to the point where one of them is willing to resign over the issue. They just essentially concede and say, if the president wants to do this, then we're going to do it. But we want to stay out of it as much as we can, and ultimately they can't stay out of it.
So in the early 90s, the U.S. invaded Panama, and Powell had a role in that. What was his official position, and what was his job during that, and how much of an active role did he have?
Yes, so in terms of Panama, and I can say also in terms of Desert Storm, Powell as chairman, it's interesting with Powell as chairman because the chairman's role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is to be the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense and to the president. It's not really supposed to be in the chain of command in terms of field commanders if there is to be a conflict. But in Dick Cheney's case, who becomes George H.W. Bush's defense secretary, Cheney is the one who actually pushes the president to hire Powell as chairman. Cheney inserts Powell into the chain of command in both of these conflicts. And so Powell plays this intermediary role between both the White House and the Secretary of Defense and the field commanders at the time. And what I write quite a bit about is in terms of the Persian Gulf War, Powell's role there in being this intermediary position, which is largely he conducts out of Washington. But in the case of the Persian Gulf War, you have a pretty volatile commander in Norman Schwarzkopf. And so Powell's diplomacy, so to speak, and his personality are really important in terms of massaging that relationship between a president and a Secretary of Defense who want to be very aggressive, and Norm Schwarzkopf, who's willing to be aggressive, but only on his timetable. Powell has to play that role in terms of bringing those two sides, being the bridge between them. And it's interesting because Schwarzkopf really saw Powell as what was referred to as a political general. And other generals don't mean that by compliment. They mean that these are generals who spend too much time in Washington and not enough time in the field. But over the course of the buildup for the Persian Gulf War and the actual execution, Schwarzkopf really comes to admire and respect Powell. And in the end, he'll make the statement that not since George Marshall has there been a military general who's had that much influence on the president in the White House. And so he really turns a corner there. And John, the last thing I'll mention here too is it's during these two wars where Powell is really dominating the press conferences to the American people about what's going on in these wars. And he's extremely articulate, extremely confident, right, determined. And the American people and the press, I would have to say, fall in love with General Powell in those press conferences. And this is really where Powell becomes a celebrity, if you will. And he attracts the trust and confidence, again, with people across the political spectrum. And so it's not just Republicans, because he's working for a Republican president at the time, but Democrats and independents as well. So this is really where his life takes a complete turn and skyrockets into superstardom that honestly exists still today, 25 years after he's retired.
We have a slide we should advance now that shows Powell with President Bush, and then I believe that's the Joint Chiefs on the other image there, Jeff, is that right?
Yeah.
All right. So let's go a little bit farther down the road. We have him, we'll go to the next slide. What was his relationship with Bill Clinton? Was that a good working relationship? Were they eye to eye, or was Powell seen as more of a Republican in a Democratic administration?
You know, it does turn out to be quite a good relationship. Certainly it gets off to kind of a controversial start because President Clinton had campaigned, for example, right, of ending the ban on gays, homosexuals serving in the military. And Powell was taking the position still at the time that there should be some sort of ban. But the president's coming in with a campaign promise. And so there are some clear contentious meetings with Powell and some of the other chair people on the Joint Chiefs staff. And Powell gets some credit, especially from people like George Stephanopoulos, who say that Powell was instrumental in coming up with the don't ask, don't tell policy as an example. And so they found a way to politically finesse the differences. Of course, this was highly controversial in Congress, not just within the military. And they grew to respect each other a lot. And I think it surprised Powell in particular that he came to really admire Clinton's intellect. And they found to have a good working relationship on various issues, including, for example, when there was the attempted assassination of President George H.W. Bush when he went back to Kuwait. President Clinton had to decide how to respond to that. So clearly he went to get advice from Powell. And Powell essentially was tutoring the president in the sense of you need to have a proportionate response to the proportionate action or threat that had happened. And the way they ended up dropping missiles on Iraq for that attempted assassination, but that further bound them together. And they only worked together for about 9 months. And unfortunately, it kind of unravels in the end when we have Somalia and the disaster of Somalia. And so that whole tragic story, of course, I even write is somewhat an anticlimactic end to Powell's career when he retires, because that tragedy in Somalia happened right before Powell retired. And I think there was a lot of blame sharing to be had there. And so it did kind of, I think, cool their relationship a little bit in the end.
So we can advance to the next slide. This is one of my favorite images here. This kind of bolsters your argument that Powell was a big, popular figure here, a superstar. I guess if you have 4 stars, you're a superstar by definition. But this is a great image of what he became to to be very popular among a lot of people, both parties, men, women. It was very, very remarkable.
It was, and this particular feature from U.S. News and World Report was just one of countless features in magazines and newspapers across the country, even internationally, in Europe especially. And so Powell developed a really keen sense of working with the media. And of course, that was honed over the years of being in Washington and understanding how the media worked. And so it just really fed into people learning more and more about Powell. And the more they learned, the more they saw him on television. And this really explodes when his book comes out about 2 years after he retires. And he goes on this big book tour, and he's on TV all the time. And this is where the pressure really starts to build, John, about why doesn't this guy run for president? Right? We haven't had a candidate like this since maybe Eisenhower.
Right.
Could attract people from both sides. And so the pressure really begins on Powell to consider running against Clinton in the 1996 election.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the book, the second half of the book, a lot of it is about his Secretary of State years. And you go into a lot of detail there, which is fascinating. What do you think? Was he a good Secretary of State?
Well, when I end the first part of the book, which ends with his military career, I make the argument by the time Powell had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was the ideal person for that job. He was the exemplary subordinate. He had all the skills and behaviors and intellect that we would want advising the president and advising the Secretary of Defense. So my question then for the second half of the book was, how should we view him then as Secretary of State? And so I went in with a very open mind. And my conclusion, the answer to that question is complicated. And the truth is, the answer, was he a good Secretary of State? The answer is yes and no. And so I try to unpack the complexities of the things that he did really well and the problems that he found himself in and or created himself. And so I'll give a few examples, first starting with some positives. Powell deserves really high marks for his leadership of the State Department itself. He inherited an absolutely ailing department, 40,000 people worldwide. The department was demoralized from the Clinton years. It was underfunded. The facilities were dilapidated. Security across the world was not good. There were shortages of personnel. The technology they were using was ancient. And because of Powell's popularity, he was able to go to Congress for the Bush administration and to get a large sum of money from Congress to completely transform the State Department in all those ways that I talked about. And of course, this boosts morale like crazy at the State Department. There's one assistant secretary who said, when Powell came to the State Department, it was like watching George Washington cross the Delaware. Just immensely popular. And he's such a good people person that he spends lots of time with people at all ranks and levels at the State Department. So he deserves high credit for that. Another thing that I write about quite a bit in the book that I also think is not well known in terms of something that he did, comes in the area of international health. In 2001, Kofi Annan at the United Nations was starting a new fund, a new global fund to help with the HIV/AIDS crisis, malaria, tuberculosis. And he wants the United States to be the first contributor to this fund, and he's asking for $200 million. President George W. Bush is not a big fan of the United Nations, and so this is a hard sell. But Powell uses his prestige and his rational logic, saying that international stability and security is threatened when we have large health problems, right? And as we're learning now, right, and even in the COVID era. And so along with Tommy Thompson, who's in the administration and Health and Human Services, they convinced Bush to contribute this $200 million to the UN fund. Well, that was just the beginning. The next year, President Bush is so impressed with the program, he increases the US contribution to $500 million. In addition to that, he creates a new fund of the United States' own control of $500 million that he characterizes as for the benefit of women and children who are suffering from these diseases across the world. And it even explodes more from there. In 2003, President Bush creates a $15 billion program to combat HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, primarily in Central America and in Africa. And Powell plays a big role in helping to administer these programs, but it all started from that initial conversation about contributing to the UN. And so I think Powell deserves immense credit for that. It's one of the, I think, one of the most unknown things about the Bush administration, and which is unfortunate. I think it was one of the most things that to be admired and respected for American citizens. And the last thing I'll just say in terms of positives is immediately after 9/11, Powell deserves immense credit. In the week that followed 9/11, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz were all pushing the president to bomb Iraq in the week after 9/11. And Powell was in there more than anybody telling the president, it makes no sense to bomb Iraq. There's no evidence that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. And even though President Bush himself believed that Iraq probably had something to do with 9/11, Powell was able to persuade him not to do something reactive and drastic that could complicate things. It's only later then, of course, that Iraq comes back into the picture. Powell deserves immense credit for that. John, I'll say a few things on the other side of the ledger here in terms of criticism, because I write quite a bit about it. One, in terms of criticism, would be the infamous speech to the United Nations Security Council, where Powell eventually gives this big speech advocating war with Iraq. And Powell himself has admitted this is the biggest failure of his career. It's the biggest blot on his record. And so my question as a historian going in was there was a lot of conventional wisdom that Powell was perhaps being unethical, that he knew the intelligence was bad, but he was making the case anyways because the president wanted him to do that. I didn't know if that was true. And one of the things that historians have with the benefit of time is declassified documents that eventually get released through Freedom of Information Act. And so I had access to documents that other people who had written about Powell didn't have at the time. And I came to the conclusion that Powell was not unethical, and that he believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And he also relied heavily upon the Central Intelligence Agency, and he trusted George Tenet, who was the director of the CIA. And I believe that Tenet believed there were weapons of mass destruction there also. Where I think the real problem comes in, the criticism that's valid, is the lack of independent critical thinking that was happening. I think this is a case of confirmation bias, where because Powell believed there were weapons of mass destruction and Tenet believed there were weapons of mass destruction, they ended up cherry picking the intelligence, latching on to all the things that confirmed what they believed to be true already because they knew it was true, right, according to their own perspective. And so other intelligence that suggested it wasn't true, or we certainly didn't know, was discounted. Even Powell's own intelligence service within the State Department was telling him that they had large skepticism about weapons of mass destruction, that our intelligence was extremely limited too in terms of connections with Iraq and terrorists, but Powell overruled some of his own people. And this reminds me of Justifer Oliver Wendell Holmes, who makes this statement just about that certitude, and certainly Powell's speech is case study in certitude, that it's not the test of certainty. Right? But Wendell Holmes says, we've been cocksure about many things that just turned out not to be true. And I think that's exactly what this was. We were cocksure that it was true, and it just turned out not to be true. No matter how many times Colin Powell said in the speech that it was true, right, and that these were facts and not conjecture. Two other quick things I'll say in terms of parts of his career as 4 years as Secretary of State that are problematic. And they have to do with the Geneva Conventions and the government, the CIA torture program coming out of the war in Afghanistan to begin with. I was extremely disappointed to learn that General Powell, as a four-star retired general, was not fighting, more determinatively that these detainees deserved Geneva protections. And so when I discovered that he wasn't arguing that case, that they deserved protections, that really was disappointing to me. What was more disheartening to say was that Powell was aware of the CIA torture program. He was in many briefings about it, and never once did he object to the program. And my thinking was, if we have a retired four-star who's not going to be in the White House advocating for Geneva protections for all people, who is going to make that case if it's not going to be retired military? Because of course we know the Geneva protections are there to protect our own people should they ever be detained, right, or held captive. And they can speak to that, especially as someone like Powell who's been in combat, right, and could perceive the problems there. So the Secretary of State years, I think, is a mixed picture. He doesn't get enough credit sometimes for what he did do, and I think there's often a misunderstanding about the weapons of mass destruction speech itself.
Thanks. Well, Jeff, it turns out that two of the last few questions that we have are also very popular with the chat room function that we have here too. There's a lot of comments, and so let's move into those, because several people have asked about going back to the presidency. There's several comments about why didn't he run? He would have been great, and you talk about that a little bit. His wife had a little bit of influence there, and not only why didn't he run, but if he did run, what party would he represent?
Well, it's interesting because there are points where he had decided to run in '96. And then over time, he would change his mind and say, no, I'm not going to run. And then he would change his mind, he would vacillate. And it was an extremely stressful time for him. He certainly was going to run as a Republican. He was going to run for the Republican nomination. He had made that decision. Even then, he was seen as a moderate Republican at the time. But some of his best and closest friends, nonetheless his wife, were advising him not to run. They didn't see his personality being the personality of a politician and all the dirty things politicians have to do, and the grubbing for money and the mud slinging that happens. They didn't see that as his forte. And there's these letters that say, look, you're a great number two, right? Your forte is not being the number one. And Powell was very stressed out by making the decision. He says he was losing lots of weight. It was bad for his health. And at the end, he decided, and he announces this in a speech, that his heart just wasn't in it to run for president. And part of what had happened was when it looked like Powell was going to run and that he would probably get the Republican nomination, the right wing, the very conservative wing of the Republican Party got nervous because Powell was such a moderate. Powell is pro-union, he's pro-affirmative action, he's pro-choice. These are all things, right, from the conservative perspective, they don't want in their candidate. And so they unleash a pretty nasty public campaign against Powell in terms of bringing things up in his past, including things like Iran-Contra. And for Powell, he's someone who doesn't like to be criticized, fairly or unfairly, but he's getting both unfair and fair criticism. And in the end, he decides his heart's not in it. And he has said, and I believe this is a good way of characterizing it, he would have liked to have been president. He would not have liked running for president.
That's a good point. I like that. A few other folks have asked, while you were researching and writing this book, what were your interactions with Powell, both electronically, in person? You met him, I know. Can you tell us your impressions and how much pressure you put on him when you were asking you questions?
Yeah, happy to share. So early on in the project, General Powell has donated his papers to the National Defense University Library at Fort McNair. But to get access to the papers that he's donated there, including, for example, his fitness reports while he was in the military, you have to get his permission to do so. And so through his office and got permission to have access to go see the documents. And so that was the beginning of the process. The plan was to reach out to him more formally for an interview years down the road. The book took me more than 10 years to complete. And my thought was, I want to ask for an interview late in the process, not early on, until I really kind of understood his story and knew the questions I wanted to ask. So I was getting, in 2017, I was getting close to emailing him, asking for the interview. And and General Powell gets a million requests for interviews. And so it's really difficult to get because his time is precious. But before I sent my email, I actually got an email from him. And I was out for dinner with my daughters, and I looked at my phone, checked my email like we all do, and it said email from General Powell, and the subject line was General Powell. And I thought, which one of my friends is playing a joke on me by creating a fictitious email? Well, the reason he sent an email at that time was because I had written an op-ed in the Hill newspaper, a Washington newspaper, political newspaper. And the article I wrote largely praised Powell, but it had some criticisms of him also. And General Powell was not emailing me to thank me for the compliments. He was emailing me to take umbrance with the criticism that I have. So he sends me a pretty caustic email about how I don't understand his relationship with President Bush the younger. And I'm smart enough not to debate a Secretary of State in an email. So I use those emails as a way to coax an interview out of him. And by the way, at the beginning of the book, John, I know you know, but for the audience, I share those emails so people can see literally what our email exchange was. And I ended up 3 months later at his house, and he was extremely gracious in answering my questions. I was there for 4 or 5 hours, and it was not a question he was unwilling to answer. And I tell people that the way you see General Powell on television in terms of being extremely intelligent, articulate, confident, funny, that's exactly the way I found him in person. He is who he is. And so I think if people see General Powell or video on YouTube of him, that's actually what he's like in person that way. Now, I will say when I was getting up from the interview and he was walking me to the door of his home, I had said something to him to the effect, General Powell, obviously there's going to be things in this book that you're not going to like. And to his credit, he said to me, Jeff, write what you think is right. And that's exactly what I did.
The question in retrospect, we hear a lot, both historians, folks reading the newspaper, about something called the Pal Doctrine. And can you go into that as far as what does that mean and how did it come about that that Powell advocated a certain style of military intervention that now basically bears his name?
Yes, and so in broadest sense, this is a byproduct of the Vietnam War experience. And so it's this, right, there was this debate about why did we lose the war, and this idea of there are many manifestations, many reasons for it. But so the idea, how, if we're going to apply power in the future, how should we do it? And more specifically, the Pal Doctrine comes out of his time specifically working with Caspar Weinberger, because Caspar Weinberger is also coming out of Vietnam as Secretary of Defense when Powell's working for him. He also wants to limit the use of US power, but if we do use it, to use substantial force to essentially try to guarantee victory, and also to have the support of the American people is also very crucial. And so by the time Powell becomes chairman, and the question of, for example, going to war in the Persian Gulf to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, Powell is actually a very reluctant warrior at this point. Powell is the one telling the president, should we contain first the Iraqis, right? Should we use trade sanctions against them? Let's use political, economic, diplomatic sanctions before we use troops. And when the president eventually decides we're not just going to defend Saudi Arabia, but we're actually going to eject the Kuwaitis or the Iraqis out of Kuwait, this is when Powell comes back. Mr. President, if we're going to do this, we can't rely on air power alone. We can't do it, pardon the expression, half-assed. We're going to have to go full. We've already got 250,000 allied troops in Saudi Arabia. Powell says we need another 250,000 troops if we are going to win this war. So it's really this compensation for what was seen as a lackluster effort, a gradual escalation in Vietnam, which ended up with results, undecisive results. And so how can we be much more decisive in outcomes in fighting wars? And this becomes known as the Pal Doctrine. And the last point I'll make on that is when Powell's Secretary of State, and we have Don Rumsfeld running the Defense Department, and Rumsfeld only wants to send 137,000 troops for the war against Saddam Hussein. Powell is very skeptical, and he actually calls the Pentagon and says, "Do you really think we're sending enough troops? I don't think we're sending enough troops." And he gets overruled. President Bush says, "This is not the Secretary of State's call, right? This is the Defense Department's call, and I'm going with Rumsfeld." And of course, we all know now Powell was right. Right, that we could have used those troops. Certainly, we didn't need those troops to overthrow Saddam Hussein, but we absolutely needed them to stabilize the country afterwards.
So one of our audience members tonight has a question about Dick Cheney, and what was Powell's relationship with him, and does he have would Powell, or does Powell have an overall assessment of Cheney's leadership, his style, what he got done? What would he say?
Powell's very complimentary of Dick Cheney as Secretary of Defense. He worked in the first Bush administration. They had an excellent working relationship, but it was never very personal. Dick Cheney is a very private person, not a very emotional person, and so they did not bond like Powell did with a lot of his superiors, often like almost in a father-son type relationship when he was a junior officer. But I think he really thought that Cheney was extremely bright and smart and a very good, effective Secretary of Defense. He describes Dick Cheney as vice president as being a completely different person, that he didn't recognize him anymore, and that part of the friction between Dick Cheney and Colin Powell happens in the Secretary of State years. And the advantage Dick Cheney has over Powell in terms of influencing policy is Dick Cheney's the vice president. He's seeing the president every day. He can go see the president regularly, where Powell doesn't do that. And that was one of my criticisms of Powell, was he didn't have as close a relationship with George W. Bush as Powell did with George H.W. Bush and Dick Cheney as Secretary of Defense. This was a much more dysfunctional team. And they didn't get along any longer. And so I think he gives Cheney high marks for the first Bush administration and has a lot of hard feelings about the second administration.
Interesting. So another question we have here, and it's one that I have on my list too. So you've written 2 great books, a lot of praise. You've now been interviewed by me from the National Museum of the U.S. Army. What could possibly top those? What are you doing next?
I'm finishing, thanks for asking, John. I'm finishing a book this year, and the title of the book is Bad Generals, Bad Admirals. And it takes a look at flagrant case studies of unethical conduct by flag officers in the US military from all the services. And so each chapter covers a different kind of topic and focuses on a different case study, but it covers things such as toxic leadership, corruption in the military, war crimes, sex crimes in the military. And so it covers, it's both historical components and contemporary components. It'll be coming out with the University of Notre Dame Press next year, I hope. Cut your microphone off, John.
Jeff, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Lovely evening and hearing all about Colin Powell. Elizabeth, let's advance the slide or 2 here. We have, again, the book is available from University of Notre Dame Press. Those of you who registered through the museum should have an email that has a discount code for the book. If you did not get that, please contact us at the museum. We'll put you in touch with them. We will, let's advance one more time and show the audience here who our next program is. It's with Dr. Catherine Landeck of Texas Women's University, who's written a very engaging book of the women, called Women with Silver Wings. This is about the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. So hopefully all of you will be able to join us for that as well. And please feel free to tell others if you enjoyed this program to tune into us. Jeff, again, a great program, great talk, and a great book, and we appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. It was great.
All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much. Have a good night.